Well, good morning, and thank you for coming across the street over here. My name is Dr. Joe Western, and I am an assistant professor of history across the street over at College of the Ozarks. And last year at this conference, I spoke about my experience teaching an upper division history course over at the college on ancient Greece, using an immersive role-playing curriculum called Reacting to the Past. And we were able to have some really good conversations after the talk about immersing students in history. And so they asked me to come back and talk about the class again this year. So that'll be our plan for this session. So let me tell you a little bit about the course. I divided this college course into 3 sections. All right. The first third was a traditional narrative history. We just walked along the timeline of ancient Greek history. The second was several weeks of theme-based lectures. So we talked about various different topics like Greek religion, Greek society. But it was the third portion of the course where we used this Reacting to the Past curriculum. And so let me walk you through that and what that looks like. So after the course ended, I asked some of my students to reflect back on the semester, and specifically to think about how this last third of the class had shaped the way that they learned. Here are some of the things that they said. And one said, "I wish there were more history courses that allowed students to not only read about events and people from different time periods, but also give them the opportunity to step into the shoes of these figures from history. Honestly, I think this style of teaching could revolutionize the way students learn, and I wish it was implemented in high schools as well. It does not only teach history, but it inspires a passion to learn. It sharpens other skill sets as well, such as public speaking, critical thinking, and it encourages students to work well in a team." Another said, "In my opinion, reacting to the past is something that should be implemented into more classrooms, perhaps even at the high school level. Overall, I enjoyed this class more than I was expecting, and benefited from it in ways far beyond learning about ancient Greece." And one more, "I really enjoyed the Reacting to the Past game. I think that I might be able to use this strategy in a classroom. Maybe not this exact game, because I'm not sure I could make it work in a high school classroom without block periods. But I would love to try and use some sort of role-playing activity with future students." And if anybody wants to shift around, I know we've got a seat over there, so feel free. So I've read enough of my own course evaluations to know that these sorts of comments are in no way a reflection of my teaching excellence, all right? But rather, it's a response to this approach to learning, which really is quite excellent. I've used Reacting to the Past across a number of years, all right, both teaching here at SofO, as well as teaching at St. Louis University. And each time I use it, students regularly comment on the value of the educational experience. So Reacting to the Past, what is this whole thing about? It was created by a gentleman named Mark Carnes at Barnard College in New York City. And as the idea has expanded, taken off, it's developed a rich community of educators who both provide feedback to game developers and also support for instructors who adopt the curriculum. So there really is a good support staff that goes along with this way of learning. In my praise of the utility of the curriculum, I certainly don't want to take credit for it. So I'll start out by talking about the general goals of the curriculum. Then I'll explain what it is and how it works more specifically. And as you can see, I've interspersed this discussion with comments taken from student reflections from the past semester in order to allow the course participants themselves to share their own perceptions and value that they believe that they've received from learning in this way. Finally, I would like to ask for your assistance in thinking through how either this curriculum specifically, or more probably the ideas behind this curriculum, might work in some high school settings and how it might complement the goals of classical education. Right, so it sounds like I'm a representative for the Reacting to the Past Corporation and I'm trying to sell their products, right? I'm not. No commissions here. But I was introduced to this concept by my own supervising teacher when I was still a graduate student at St. Louis University. And she was actually one of the co-authors of one of the books. And she was a big believer in immersive learning. And I certainly was very apprehensive at the beginning, especially being so new to teaching myself, to turn over the classroom to the students and to step back to the rear of the classroom. But even though I was intimidated, students seemed to appreciate it and learn the sorts of things that I want them to learn in my classroom. So I would say, as a history instructor, I'm someone obviously who's naturally drawn to history. I find the stories fascinating. I find the historical characters captivating. But much of my teaching experience, not that there's a whole lot of it, much of my teaching experience comes from teaching general education or required history classes, the sorts of classes that anyone who wants to graduate has to take. And in these classes, there are lots of people who don't have that same natural attraction to history that I do. In fact, it seems like there are two types of people who walk through the door of a history classroom. The first kind are those that share my natural interest, and certainly there are some of those. But then there are those on that opposite side of things. They resent the fact that they have to sit through something as irrelevant and useless to their modern day lives as a history class. And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of middle ground between those two groups of people. But it's the capacity for challenging those first group of students, the ones who find history intrinsically interesting, and the ability to engage and bring in the second type of student that I really appreciate about this approach to learning. So I suppose I should be upfront about what it is that I hope to accomplish in a history classroom. Of course, I want students to learn about what happened in the past. All right? So I want them to understand how they see their own places in the world and how they fit into the larger timeline. I appreciate narrative history. That's what provides the overarching framework for being able to talk about other things. But that's not the main thing. History has this remarkable capacity, I would say, for helping people to develop perspective. Our own individual experiences are so limited, but when we study the past, we get to aggregate the experiences of lots more people. And so human history helps students to understand how other human beings operate, why they make certain decisions. It helps them to appreciate what being human is all about. And in this way, at least ideally, the study of human history helps students to develop empathy. No matter what era of history I teach then, I want students to be able to practice the skill of understanding how people who are different from them learn, think, and make decisions. This is not only the core skill of a historian, but I would suggest that it's the core skill of anyone who lives in community. And it's this overarching goal that I think allows a curriculum like Reacting to the Past to really shine. At its core, the Reacting to the Past curriculum is comprised of over 20 different published games. I've listed them there for you on the handout. And each game is set in a specific historical moment. And each game is separate from all the others. So they don't build off one another, but they're distinct learning opportunities. The game that I've used the most often, and the one that I used a year ago across the street at SofO, is set in the Greek city-state of Athens in 403 BC, just after Athens has been defeated by Sparta in the famous great Greek civil war, the Peloponnesian War. And so that I'm not just constantly talking about abstractions, I'll draw my specific examples from that Athenian game just to help you understand how this whole thing works. And so each student, when they come into a reacting classroom, each student is assigned to play the role of a specific historical character. Now, many of these characters are accurate historical figures pulled out of the pages of history, and others are fabricated, sort of built in order to allow students to grapple with specific political or social or economic issues. Each player receives a role information sheet, which provides personal story of their character, biographical background, as well as the issues that resonate most clearly with them. The students then work to become more familiar with their characters, and they begin that process of trying to see the world through their characters' eyes. Most players then are separated into teams or factions. These factions are united by common goals. So for example, in the Athens game, players are divided into the radical Democrats, the followers of the Athenian statesman Pericles, the oligarchs, and the followers of Socrates. Each one of these groups has a unique vision for how Athens should be governed, as well as on various other social issues. Sometimes these viewpoints overlap with other factions, while other times they're diametrically opposed. The player role sheets, after the biographical information, the information about the positions of the faction, They conclude with a list of victory objectives. Accomplishing these objectives wins students the game. Most of the objectives for an individual are shared with members of a student's faction, while some are unique even to players within that faction. Now, these objectives usually take the form of ensuring that specific laws are passed. So the immediate context of the Athens simulation is the city's citizen assembly. Once the game starts, each class period then is a session of the city's citizen assembly. Various proposals are introduced, they're debated by players, and at some time by the end of the session, a vote is held and a proposal is either passed or defeated. As the sessions progress, players then either cross off or they highlight their victory objectives, whether they've been met or not met, and this contributes towards the students winning the game. So I said that most students are assigned to a faction. Right? There are several players who serve as indeterminate characters. These players don't have a faction, so they're a bit like free agents. They too have rich backstories, and they have particular interests that they are interested in advancing for discussion, and they have their own separate victory conditions. For example, in Athens, Gorgias is a teacher of rhetoric and desires education to be a topic debated by the assembly. Yet importantly, these indeterminants are largely left to their own devices and their own discretion when it comes to other major issues, allowing them to vote in the assembly however their character sees fit. This provides members of factions opportunities to persuade these figures of the merits of their positions, and it ensures that the voting sessions do not have predetermined outcomes, which would be the case if there were only these factions that had to vote in a specific way. The game has no predetermined outcome. And you can use the same game sort of over and over, and depending on the actions and the arguments and the voting patterns of the people in the class, you can have many different paths forward. So that's the overall experience. All right, so now let me walk you through what a semester actually looks like. Tasks that I've described are a tall order for students to master, especially ones, like most of the students, who have a very little detailed knowledge of the period that they're now being dumped in the middle of. The curriculum comes with an instructor manual that provides good instructions for how to organize the game, how to deal with the major issues of gameplay. And the curriculum is divided then into 3 phases. There's a setup phase, there's the gameplay phase, and then there's a debriefing phase at the end. And the length of all of this is completely scalable, but typically there are about 4 classes devoted to setup. There are 6 or 7 that are devoted to the actual gameplay, and then 1 or 2 at the end to kind of unpack what it is that we've just done. And so we're talking about a total of roughly 12 classes. And you can expand this, you can compress it if you need to, bless you. But staying on schedule can be quite a bit of a challenge, right, once the whole thing gets rolling. So phase 1. I would say that there are 4 main aspects to this setup session. First thing that happens is the students receive their role sheets. They meet their factions if they have one. Secondly, though, in order to help students understand where their particular historical moment fits into the larger historical framework, they need a fair amount of historical background. In the case of Athens, I provide at least a lecture or 2 on the Greek world of the 5th century, the development of the unique political configurations of both Athens and Sparta, and a narrative of the Peloponnesian War. Each student receives a game book in addition to their role sheet. So a game book is I've got some more examples of it on the back table there, but a game book that not only provides the historical background, but it also provides the game rules, and as we'll talk about in just a second, has a lot of the primary text that we'll engage with. All right, and that is the third aspect of the setup session, what I would consider the core part of the reacting experience, and that is the reading of primary texts. So if I'm going to ask students to jump into the worldviews of people who lived over 2 millennia ago, students need to read texts written in the period. These texts are also included in the game book, and typically I have students begin reading these texts well before we get to the game period, because they're not easy texts, and giving them time to explore them helps students understand how people in the past thought about the issues with which they're now being asked to wrestle. So for example, in the Athens game, we read selections from Xenophon, we read selections from Plato's Republic, we read Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus to understand Spartan values, we read Pericles so that we can understand how the Athenians saw themselves. And I would say that the neat thing about reading these classic texts in the context of the reacting game is that the assignment of specific roles gives students a certain lens through which to look as they approach these texts. Students who may have very little interest in reading Plato now look to understand the text so that they have ways that they might get a leg up on their opponents in the game. One of my favorite experiences using reacting to the past curriculum was when I used the French Revolution game teaching at St. Louis University. During one of the game sessions, I watched as a freshman baseball player who was not a strong academic student, but was very competitive by nature. He was getting more and more frustrated during one of the game sessions. Finally, he stood up out of his seat and he blurted out, "You can't make that argument, Rousseau says." Before he could even finish his sentence, he stopped mid-sentence, looked around a bit sheepishly, sat back down and said, "I never thought in my life I would begin a sentence with Rousseau says." This portion of the setup period culminates in a challenging open book test over the texts on which the factions work together. Right? So I do hold them accountable for reading and understanding those texts. And in addition to using this test as part of the student's grade, I award the faction that collectively scores the highest, or the indeterminates who I allow to work together as a group, an additional vote bonus in the assembly. Competition fuels effort. The last element of the setup portions is a series of strategizing sessions where I give factions the time to figure out how they're going to approach the game. So the curriculum provides for a loose framework of topics on a certain schedule for each one of the game sessions. Each player then is assigned to take the lead on a particular issue for their faction. This involves doing some research on the topic, writing a 2 to 3 minute speech that the student delivers before the assembly. Speech lays out a faction's position on the issue and attempts to persuade the rest of the assembly delegates, particularly the indeterminates. This obviously requires some time and effort from the students, so I guide them a bit and then I turn them loose at the tail end of the setup session to do their research and to prepare. And students have reported that the setup time is highly valuable. One student reflected at the end of the semester, "When I first heard about the idea, reacting to the past seemed to be an activity for history experts. I was relieved to find plenty of class time dedicated to the explanation of the game and its purpose." And students are often very apprehensive that they don't know enough about the period in order to do well. They're not experts on 5th century Greece. But the curriculum helps the instructor offer a lot of help to them along the way. All right, so phase 2, the meat of the curriculum, the game sessions. One of the most interesting aspects, I would argue, of the reacting to the past experience is that during the game sessions, the instructor does step to the very back of the classroom and turns the entire experience over to the students. In ancient Athens, students are randomly assigned certain governmental positions, so that there's always a student who is the president of the citizen assembly. In other games, this role is specifically assigned to a certain character, if that's historically appropriate. While in others, the first action of the game is a campaign and the resulting vote for this position. From that point on, the president of the assembly announces the topic or topics of the day, invites other participants up to speak, moderates the debate, and conducts the vote. The students run the game sessions on their own. Thus, when the game sessions start, we transform the classroom into the assembly by forming the desks or tables into a semicircle, and I step to the back and allow them to do their thing. As an instructor then, I do several things. All right? First of all, I evaluate the students' speeches. All right? So I use a rubric as students are delivering the speeches before the assembly to make sure that I'm holding them to a particular standard. Helps the students to take the exercise seriously and to do well. More importantly, though, I spend a lot of time trying to encourage students behind the scenes. And at the beginning, students are apprehensive about many things. One student reflected, "Reacting to the past gave me knots in my stomach from the first time I heard about it." It isn't so much that I hate speaking in front of people, it's that I hate speaking in front of people about a topic that I don't fully understand and risk sounding dumb, especially in front of my peers. So hearing that I was supposed to embody a person from ancient Athens and give speeches from their point of view on topics that pertain to their life sounded absolutely horrible to me. Yet this student was also one of the students with whose comments I started the talk, one who, by the end of it, recommended that this curriculum be implemented more widely. Another student responded, "In the beginning of the semester, I was dreading reacting to the past because I've usually found that I perform better in lecture format more than any other learning style. And again, going into the game, I was very nervous because I'm a quiet person. and I was not sure if I could play my character's role well enough. The game ended up being a more significant role in my learning of ancient Greece than I thought it would. All right, so because students are apprehensive, I walk around behind the assembly members, behind that semicircle of desks, and I pass notes of encouragement. I listen to the debate. I try to provide suggestions if I think a particular character could make a specific point at this moment that maybe he or she is not thinking about. I'm also available if a character has a question about anything specific. And finally, I answer procedural questions and encourage the president to kind of keep things moving along so that we don't run out of time. Typically, we find that the first session or two starts out fairly slowly. As students sort of get the hang of the format, they get over their initial jitters about talking in front of their peers. But as we get into the game, the more students find that the allotted class time is actually not enough for them to say everything that they want to say. I wish we had 30 more minutes of class, or wow, that went fast, are not comments that I'm used to receiving from my history classes. But I would say that they're regular features of reacting sessions. By the time we get to the last session, there's typically some sort of culminating development that makes clear which faction or factions have won and which have not. Students that have won receive a small extra credit grade bump. Other than that, however, student grades come entirely from their own work on the open book test on the primary texts, the speeches that they write over major issues, the delivery of those speeches, and a participation grade. The participation component is a comparatively high percentage, compared to my normal classes, because as long as a student buys in, as long as a student is willing to engage, as long as a student is willing to give this a chance, they can't help but learn. Despite operating in factions, each student receives an individual grade for the work that that individual student does. And I think that's really important for students to understand. I also assign a short character journal assignment after each session, in which the student explains in character why he or she voted the way that he or she did on any issues that came up during the previous session. This helps to hold the student accountable for making decisions as their character, as opposed to as their 21st century selves. One student mentioned, the most difficult part of the class was assuming the role of portraying a person who lived thousands of years ago and had a completely different worldview than I did. I found it tough not to make my character act like a 21st century American. Another student observed, the game journals helped me to keep myself on track as to my character's mental state and motivations, and helped me direct my own actions in line with such standards. Thus, I grew to appreciate my own worldview more as I acted from the premises of one that was entirely alien to me. All right, phase 3. The last phase of the game is a brief debrief session. In this part, we drop the in-game characters and we process through what happened. Students are allowed to share some of their victory objectives, which helps other students to understand why they may have taken the action that they did, or voted in the way they did, or make the argument that they did in the previous sessions. And then we talk about how events really played out in history. We compare them to how they went in our game. And this allows us to discuss why things may have happened differently in our telling of the history than they did in the playing out of history in real time. And it also ensures that we do focus on factual accuracy. I want them to understand what really happened in history, and this allows us to move in that direction. So despite a lot of apprehension, the majority of students believe that it was a positive experience. And so I want to share with you 5 of the major benefits I see to using this approach to learning. Right, so the first one, I already mentioned the way that competition fuels engagement with historical texts. As I mentioned at the outset, I'm someone who's naturally drawn to history. I find it naturally interesting, but many of my students don't find it naturally interesting. Yet when they compete against their classmates, many of them are more motivated to engage, more motivated to understand. The competitive motivation is interesting, since the grades of every student, the grades are based on his or her own work. Winning only gives a small extra credit bonus, and losing has absolutely no penalty at all. Yet it's enough to motivate. I found it quite interesting as I was reading through the reflections at the end of the semester that not a single student mentioned the extra credit as being something that was really transformative. It gets them going, it gets them into the game, but it doesn't end up driving their learning. At least they weren't willing to tell me it was. One of the most interesting aspects of the reacting classroom is the way that the class comes together to bond in spite of the competitive environment. Even though students directly compete with other factions, I make it clear at the beginning of the semester that preserving civility in the classroom is absolutely essential. Most, if not all, students, because of their apprehension and nervousness about giving speeches, want to root for each other. Right? Even as competing students are readying their questions for the speaker who's addressing the assembly, you can also tell that they're secretly rooting for that speaker as a fellow classmate. In the instances in which students freeze up, stumble over their speeches, you can almost feel the classroom, their fellow students, willing them their support. No one likes to be embarrassed, and they all recognize that they're going to be in the same boat. And so what I've found in my experience is that these classes often become the tightest knit classes that I teach. It's really kind of an interesting thing to see. Secondly, giving students specific roles fuels their engagement. Students report that receiving a role gives them a particular human connection with that material. One said, "I was honestly surprised how invested I became in the game and how much I wanted to understand and defend what my character thought." Another, "I learned so much about Athenian culture just from trying to be Athenian. I researched finances and post-war economy from a book on reserve in the library. We had to investigate how much the average worker earned in a day, monetary systems, the mechanics of a trireme, the percentages of various economic groups in Athens, and other economic information that I probably would not have looked up on my own." Another student came to realize how human emotion plays into human motivations. "I felt," he said, "almost immediately attached to my character during the first session. The game made political turmoil real to me. I thought more deeply about the problems that plagued Athens after the war with Sparta. Just in reading the biography of my character, there was a great urgency in Athens, as well as a great fear. The Democrats feared the death of their beloved democracy. The Socratics fear that without education, the people of Athens will be deceived, just like when Alcibiades came to power in the past years." And so for this student, I hope that this understanding of human motivation provides him with a deeper insight into how human beings tend to operate and how they go about their business in the present as well. Thirdly, students are often required to adopt and argue for a position in character that they do not necessarily personally hold. Students who are assigned to the oligarchic faction, for example, are required to argue against democracy in the course of the game sessions. Female students who are assigned the roles of male characters find themselves forced to argue for limited, male-only political participation. And so I try to strategically assign students roles that will force them to challenge their ways of looking at the world. This allows them to better understand how someone might construct arguments that support positions to which they themselves are personally opposed. Before being forced to think in this different way, one student said, "I could not understand how my character did not like medics." Those are resident foreigners in Athens. This could be tied to today's debate on immigration. "I couldn't understand how people could be anti-immigrant. I think this game helped me to place myself in another person's shoes. While I still do not necessarily agree with that point of view," right, the one that I was forced to adopt in game, "I do understand why someone would feel this way. I feel like I have become more empathetic because of this." In the fourth place, students reported that the reacting game helped them to appreciate the study of history in a variety of ways that they hadn't before. Several students discussed an appreciation for the commonalities of the human experience across time. "It taught me that while people of the past had different thought processes and cultural backgrounds, they still shared many of the same human experiences and thoughts that we do. For that reason, we should focus more on the human aspect as historians." And again, topics discussed over the course of the 6 assembly sessions were parallel to some concerns present in modern societies. This fact proves that even though people are separated by thousands of years and miles, human nature remains similar, and the questions people want answers for today are not new. So for these students, I hope that the study of history becomes a viable avenue for them for understanding people, for understanding current events. One of the comments that I was most pleased to read at the end of the semester was from a young lady who reflected on her own ability to learn. She was one of the students who had used the word dread to describe her anticipation of this part of the class because she called herself a traditional learner. But by the end, she reflected this way: "I realize as I am writing that the only reason why I love lectures so much is because it is the most undemanding way of learning information, at least for me. I write down what is on the slides, I remember it for the test, and then forget it. I don't think I will easily forget what I learned from this game. She then, in her reflection, went on to walk me through Bloom's taxonomy and show how the class had helped her analyze, evaluate, and create new knowledge for herself. She went on to recommend that the curriculum be adopted in more history settings. Now, I certainly wouldn't suggest that those who prefer a lecture format all do so for the same reasons as this girl, but I was encouraged to see her reflecting on the way that she saw herself as a learner. Hopefully this personal reflection will translate into future classes for her. And fifth, as the previous comments indicate, students end up discovering the ways that the issues and the debates of the past relate to current events. Debating the institution of a democratic system in Athens can't help but shape the way students see our political system. Discussing the place of resident foreigners in the Athenian Assembly can't help but to engage the topic of immigration today. Trying to fund money in the Athenian budget for funding education helps students to appreciate the struggles of meeting competing priorities with limited resources. One student gained a better understanding of the complexities of politics. I started to notice that it did not matter how good our point was or how strong our counter-argument was. The other side was not going to change their mind because their goal was to win the game. This frustrated me because I was able to relate it all too well back to politics today. How often does a side or an individual refuse to change their position or see anyone else's position because of the drive to win? In many ways, I can confess that the students are not the only ones who are apprehensive at the beginning of the game. As an instructor, I also wonder if I'm going to be able to answer all of their questions, if I'm going to be able to smooth over the dynamics of the game. Yet for the instructor as well as for the students, the payoff at the end is significant. A student who had expressed initial apprehension wound up concluding, reacting to the past was a different approach to teaching history, and at first I was skeptical of the learning outcome quality it would provide. I will gladly admit that my expectations were exceeded, and I experienced a feeling of sadness when the game was over. And then another student summed up what I hope would be the experience of many students. He wrote, "Instead of simply telling me the narrative of Greek history, the class helped me to better understand the world from the perspective of the people I was studying. It provided me with a unique experience that most history classes focused on standard historical research would not. Leaving the class, I feel better acquainted with my own personal beliefs and my place in the modern world." All right, before I turn it over to conversation, let me just make a couple of brief logistical observations because these usually come up as questions. I told you that one of the nice things about the curriculum is that it's scalable. All right, so it's scalable in terms of different class sizes. There is a critical mass of students that's required, obviously, in order to be able to have enough roles to be able to form several different factions. The Athens game, for example, requires at least 9 students, but accommodates up to 28. I'm using the French Revolution game this semester in my West Civ 2 class, and that has up to 41 roles. So that depending on the game, you can find different games that cater to different class sizes. Additional roles for some games have even been developed and placed online for larger classes. So I talked about the supportive community that's constantly generating content. The instructor's manual provides direction for apportioning roles among the different factions for classes of different size in order to keep gameplay balanced. All right, game sessions also require a certain amount of time to carry out. I've typically played the game in classes that last an hour and 20 minutes. By the time I give factions a few minutes to collect their thoughts, a few minutes to strategize, and I go over any classroom business, there's usually about an hour for the actual game sessions to take place. And as I mentioned, the time goes quickly. All right? Even with artificially cutting off the debate, we usually end up behind schedule. Another important thing to note is I've personally only used the French Revolution game and the Athens game that I've been describing, so I can't necessarily speak to the quality of the other ones that are listed out there on your sheet. Each one of these games is written by a different author or a different series of authors, and so they, I would assume, vary dramatically in quality. I did look into adopting a game centered on the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, but I ended up deciding against adopting it because it was based on an interpretation of assembling the canon of Scripture that I find at odds with how I think that came to pass. And so I'm not going to necessarily stand up here and champion the quality of every single one of those games. So I opted today for providing some anecdotal evidence from my own experience to share how students that I've taught have thought about the benefits of this approach. If you're interested in more specific data on the approach to learning, it's been the subject of a number of more scientific studies, and I've recommended a couple of published books on the subject, which I've listed for you at the top of your handout. So those look a little bit more at the hard data, more than just one classroom, more than just one instructor. So if you're interested in looking at that, that's available for you. And finally, this curriculum is developed for the college level. That's the intended audience. But over the course of numerous semesters teaching it, I don't believe that it's inherently out of the reach of high schoolers, especially ones that have been taught or trained to read well and to think critically. Students do not have to be history experts in order to have a meaningful experience. Perhaps expanding the setup portion of the curriculum, providing additional historical background, reading through the primary text more slowly and with lots of guidance would make the experience more approachable for slightly younger students. But as I indicated at the outset of the presentation, it is the opinion of my students who have recently experienced this for the first time that high schoolers would certainly benefit from this approach. And so I'd be happy to answer any questions, turn this talk, this lecture, which I've just spent 40 minutes denigrating, lecture, into more of a conversation so that we can help each other kind of think about either this curriculum specifically or just some of the ideas, some of the things that you've heard me say that you might be able to take without using this whole thing, but be able to incorporate into your own experiences. Anybody have anything that you'd like to talk about or any questions that I could perhaps answer? Yeah.
Do you find that students tend to adopt the positions that their fictional character did? My concern, I was thinking about doing this with theology, and actually the Council of Nicaea was the one that I had started. But I worry that if they adopt a heretical position, that they may be influenced to go to that side.
Yeah, what I would think that you would want to do, especially for something that's woven into theology so much, is to maybe extend the debrief sessions by a number of sessions, so that you can really help them unpack, okay, this is what you've been asked, this is the position you've been asked to take and argue for, and you've done it well, you've adopted that for the purposes of our game, but here is how we might better think about some of these issues. I have not found that students become so ingrained into the positions that they're assigned that that's what they come to adopt personally. The ladies that I've assigned male roles don't end up thinking that they should be excluded from political participation. But I haven't tried it with something that's as nuanced theologically as that particular one. So I would suspect it would be okay, but I think you would probably want to be very deliberate and very intentional about unpacking orthodox beliefs after the game. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
Have you seen anything like this for young? I teach 6th grade.
Yeah.
I'm like, there's no way my 6th graders could they haven't learned yet how to argue. They haven't had logic yet.
Right.
They haven't learned, the art of persuasion. They haven't learned those things yet because we're just in the foundational grammar stage.
Sure.
But I love the idea of having history come alive. I was a history major in college, here actually.
Nice.
So I love history, and we didn't get to do anything fun like that. But I don't know how to.
Yeah.
I mean, I love the idea, but I don't know how I would change it to work for 6th grade. I mean, do you have any ideas, or have you heard of anybody doing something like this for younger kids?
I haven't heard of anybody doing sort of this full-blown curriculum for that age, because you're right, so much of it relies on the skills that they probably haven't been introduced to yet. But my initial reaction is to pull out some of the elements, maybe the competitive element, maybe the giving students a particular lens of trying to put students in a particular historical moment to try and think through. That's going to be, it's hard to jump out of a worldview for me. It's harder for my college students. It'll be really hard for a 6th grader, right, to be able to try and imagine what it's like to see something from someone else's perspective. But one of the things that I tried, one of the things that I pulled out myself from this idea to take into another classroom is for my medieval class that I'm teaching right now in medieval Europe. I had students read the Rule of St. Benedict, and then I had them imagine what it would be like for them to try to create a rule, if you will, for a brand new dorm on campus, fictional dorm. So if there was this learning community where students could voluntarily join because they wanted to focus on living an orderly Christian life, trying to adopt sort of the same goals that Benedict was wrestling with, how might they take what Benedict was trying to do and adapt it to their own context? And so I had them write an introduction modeled on the introduction of Benedict's rule. I had them come up with about 20 little paragraphs on various aspects. And then I had them analyze afterwards how their rule differed from Benedict's approach so that we could kind of talk through that. And my main goal for doing that was to take this idea of trying to get students to think through history along with the people who are creating it, to better be able to appreciate what Benedict himself was trying to accomplish and why people for the next several centuries were attracted to this. As college students, trying to sell them on the idea that rules are good, that structure imposed from the outside is good, is a challenge. But I think it was really important for them to be able to understand the historical document in that way. So I wonder if there might be something that you could do there where you have this historical moment, whatever it is, and you say, okay, let's try to imagine what this guy or what this lady was trying to do as he or she was going through the process. And in that way, you might be able to pull them out in some small way of their own ways of thinking and get them to understand. Now, sixth grade is not my forte, so I don't know if that's even too tall of an ask for a sixth grader, but I wonder if maybe something like that would be accessible.
Just finding something more of like the themes and the ideas.
Yeah.
And make it applicable to their life.
Yeah, so what makes this good? I think it's the competitive nature. I think it's the giving students a specific role, a specific lens through which to see history. It's challenging them to wrestle with ideas in history that may help them think about ideas today. Some of those individual pieces, I think, are translatable outside of the curriculum. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to reference what she was asking about. My husband teaches 7th grade history, and they've done some like Civil War reenacting type things. So even if you had a field trip or a day where you are living that role, or the 2nd graders go over to the little prairie, the little schoolhouse, and they pretend like they're a little house on the prairie all day long. Like, that's them living in that time period, eating what they ate and doing what they do. And my husband came all dressed up in his Civil War, a whole Civil War outfit. And it's just, they're like, what is that? You know, you brought a gun to school? And they just loved it because it was jumping out of the history book to them. Yeah.
The biggest thing that I really the biggest barrier that I find that I have to break down, especially teaching required classes, is just getting students to see that history in some way can inform. It is relevant. It is something that they can use to help them think about their lives as they go throughout their daily lives. And if this is one way to get them to see history as something where they're not just memorizing something and regurgitating it back on a test, because I see value in that. I think it's important to know this history, but that's a tough sell for a lot of them. And so this just seems to be able to help them see sort of that human connection a little bit more. What other thoughts or questions or ideas that you see being valuable in this approach to be able to put into your own contexts?
I guess I could offer this. So,
please.
We don't teach history at our school. We don't believe it. No. We're in one of those schools where, it's like a great book school, so we don't have a history class.
Yeah.
Or so that
Yeah.
split it in.
Yeah.
But as I listen to this, it seems to me like this is a great cross-disciplinary opportunity.
Yeah.
Because in the progymnosmata, you have speeches and character and narratives. These can be written from perspectives.
Yep.
And yeah, you could see this, right? So where you could integrate this and have days where certain roles were assigned to bring a speech and character, and they are specifically to develop empathy, as you've been speaking to. So I can see this.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And if you look down, if you scroll down through the list of games, I think you can find a number of cross-disciplinary opportunities there. Some focus a little bit more, some have a little bit more of a science focus. And so you can see some sort of connection between science and history. Some deal more with theology, and so you might be able to incorporate a historical, theological view there. Some Some I think are a little bit more literature-based. And so you can tie together different disciplines, and maybe depending on if you come from smaller contexts with smaller classrooms, maybe the bringing together of a couple of different classes would be possible by investigating that. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts or comments? I know I gave the rosy side to this. There are students who feel very overwhelmed. Yeah, I don't know if I go horror stories, but at least not horror stories that they're willing to share with me. But there is a lot of cheerleading. There's a lot of coaching. There's a lot of, well, have you thought about, passing a note? Have you thought about suggesting this? Or I think your character would really be well suited to this moment because this is the debate and this is something your character thinks about. There's a lot of trying to get students, point students in the right direction, because it's not something that you necessarily just look at and say, oh, I definitely understand what it's like to be an Athenian in the 4th century BC, 5th century.
What's your thought process when you assign the characters that would have the leadership role? Do you go for the natural leaders, or do you try to encourage?
Now, I go for the natural leaders because there do need to be some strong characters that drive things forward. If you have a student who's completely overwhelmed acting as the president of the assembly, then that just introduces a whole nother level. Not that that student couldn't benefit from being pushed in that direction, but usually what I do is I wait until about halfway through the semester before I assign the roles, and I try throughout the whole semester to figure out, I try to balance the factions so that one faction doesn't necessarily have all of the real strong students in it. So I try to balance the factions for academic ability as well as how outgoing they are, because if a faction is full of very strong students but they're all very quiet students, then that faction may have a harder time engaging and getting their point across. So I try to balance things out in that way, and then I also do try to look for some students that I think will be, if the president of the assembly sits up in front of the class with a semicircle of people staring at them, and if you have someone who is really uncomfortable with that, then that student is really going to struggle to be able to invite people into conversations and that sort of thing. So I do try to strategically assign roles in that way. Sometimes it works really well. Other times, boy, did I miss the boat, and it did not go nearly as well as I had hoped it would. Anything else that I can share with you or invite you to share? All right. Well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for listening to me. I appreciate the conversation and the exchange of